Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we examine the COVID resurgence with the Omicron variant sweeping through country after country. In the UK and France, new cases are running at 1 million a week, and in the USA by over 3 million. Despite the fact that Omicron seems substantially less potent than previous strains, particularly for the fully vaccinated, the sheer volume of cases has health services buckling under the pressure. Today, we turn to the top expertise across the world and in the UK to tell us the progress of the vaccination programme internationally and at what stage the virus is likely to move from pandemic to the endemic phase. First, Dr. Jerome Kim, Secretary General of the Seoul-based International Vaccination Institute, has consistently warned on the dangers of a coronavirus variant emerging out of Africa that could threaten all of the progress made. Then, Dr. Chris Smith of Cambridge University examines the development of the virus and speculates on the likelihood of humankind learning to live with this coronavirus. But first, your tweets, emails and messages on our shows over the holiday period. Let's see a couple of clips.
I tell you what, Alex, as Shirley Ballas, I think you would be fantastic. You've got the composure, you've got the stature, you've got the tartan trousers. I think you've got the dangly legs that would be perfect for Straight League. I would love you to do it. I think you'd be fantastic. Now, Taz, you've got the legs, you've got the shoes, you've got the body. You're just perfection. You'd be fantastic. Strictly speaking, Lewis, you'd be rubbish.
Would be as well. One of my favourite actors, and a voice I use often when I get those phone calls from these call centres that want to sell you something. I don't know who you are.
My name's John.
I don't know what you want.
I just need to know how long you've been registered at your current address.
If you're looking for ransom, I don't have money. But what I do have are a very particular set of skills. Skills I've acquired over a long period of time. Skills that make me a nightmare for people like you.
It's okay, I'll call back later.
The very talented Kate Robbins and Lewis MacLeod. And Farah Hamid says, fantastic show, couldn't stop laughing. Amber Lovett says, last week's show was excellent and had us in stitches. Kate Robbins and Lewis MacLeod are hilarious and just what we need right now. Thank you to all at the Alex Salmond Show and a happy and safe new year from Amber and Andrew. William Nichols says, absolutely brilliant. All the very best. A couple of days in Edinburgh, but tonight I got a breath of fresh air. Thank you. And finally, Craig Jackson says, hugely funny. Watched it twice today. Second time funnier than the first. No doubt we'll watch it again and again. Well, I'm glad we could have some light relief over the festive season, but now back to the serious business of coronavirus which faces us all. Now, even in countries heavily vaccinated, Omicron has broken through to infect millions, although the vaccines have been successful in limiting the impact of the virus. However, what will be the position in the many countries who have, as yet, hardly begun mass vaccinations? Dr. Jerome Kim gives his assessment to Alex.
Dr. Kim, welcome back to the Alex Salmond Show.
My pleasure. Hello. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you as well. Now, if we look at the infection rate worldwide, in countries, highly vaccinated countries like the UK, France, America, the number of people infected is running at the millions per week from the Omicron variant. But in Korea, it's just a few thousand. How do we explain the differences between some countries which are heavily infected by the new variant and others which seem to be, as yet, escaping it?
So I think, if we think about lines of defense, and really, if we think about COVID as a war, the first line of defense are the things that we can all do, that we know prevent infection itself. That would be distancing, masks, avoiding crowds, good hygiene, hand washing and things. The second line of defense is vaccination. And, Korea is up into the 80% range now, and for full vaccination as well. And, many of the countries are struggling to get above 70%. The United States is still in the 60% range. If you imagine the United States has 350 million people, that's 40% of 350 million. That's 120 million unvaccinated people. And each one of them a potential target for the virus. The third line of defense are the things that we do medically. We can treat people. Now, we have good drugs. that are oral. We have isolation, which keeps people from infecting other people. And the final thing are the things that governments can do. And they are things that we really hate, things like vaccine passes and vaccine passports and all these things. But governments have to do that. And when you look at Asia or Australia, the governments were very effective in mobilizing people to support the idea behind isolation, behind masks, behind distancing. And so that's actually still working as a first line of defense. Adding on to that now the layer of vaccination and good treatment, you really are able to impact COVID-19 a lot better than places where you don't have that first line of defense. I think the other thing about Omicron is, and again, and unfortunately, Omicron is not the end of the Greek alphabet. It's not the omega. So we're going to have additional variants develop. But Omicron has the ability to infect people who've been vaccinated and to infect people who've been naturally infected. Now, of course, vaccination does what it's supposed to do, even with Omicron. We know it reduces hospitalization. We know it reduces death. So we have to vaccinate unvaccinated populations. And that means, special inducements, getting people and getting children vaccinated are really important. We started to see here in Korea a number of outbreaks in childcare settings, and the government has really made a push to get parents to vaccinate their kids. And in countries, like the UK or in Korea, where 95% of children are vaccinated against measles, it seems almost inconceivable that we couldn't get parents to be concerned enough to vaccinate their children against COVID.
So are you saying that the evidence seems to show that children at school are being a key vector of the infection in this latest variant?
As it has been a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Who are the unvaccinated now? They're the people who didn't get vaccinated during the initial rounds, during the initial push, and then children. So in the United States, we're seeing record numbers of children being hospitalized. We're seeing increasing numbers of children all over the world getting sick. Now, they don't get as sick as adults, but it doesn't take much. I mean, we don't have as many pediatric beds in hospitals, so that it isn't going to take as much to fill them up. And that would be a horrible thing.
And looking at the statistics internationally, how do we explain how France and the UK and America have millions of cases a week, whereas many countries in Africa, relatively unvaccinated, still are recording cases in the low thousands? How is that disparity explained?
That's a great question. And it actually raises the issue that there are actually three gaps. The first gap is, we've been talking about this for the past year, is the supply of vaccine gap. So high-income countries preferentially got vaccine first. Low-income countries got it and are still receiving it. 91% of those people living in low-income countries have not seen the first dose of vaccine. The second gap, and this is becoming clearer now as vaccine supply is becoming less of an issue, is the vaccination gap. So again, just because you have vaccine doesn't mean the country is going to deploy it effectively. And is that magical threshold of herd protection going to be at 70%? Probably not. 80%, again, it's looking like it may not be. 90 to 95%, or will we ever get there? There are some people who are saying, we're going to have to get through this the old-fashioned way. Yes, we can keep people out of the hospital with vaccination, but COVID will develop and mutants will arise, and eventually people will become exposed and will be relatively protected. And I guess the final gap, and this is one we haven't talked much about, it's a $2 billion gap in diagnostics. So when you look at the high-income countries, they're doing hundreds of COVID tests per 100,000 people in the population. When you look in Africa, it's almost zero. And so they're not, you only find an infection if you look for it. The other part of it is the sequencing gap. Where are the mutants arising? The mutants are arising in outbreaks. There were outbreaks in Africa that we weren't aware of, and mutants have arisen out of some of them, like the beta mutant or now the Omicron mutant, the Delta mutant in India. So these gaps are the source of problems. They're prolonging COVID and they're generating variants, and these variants have the potential to undermine the progress that we've made in the development of vaccines.
In your assessment, Dr. Kim, did Omicron emerge from an unvaccinated country somewhere in Africa, or was there a cross-species interaction between humans and animals? I mean, where did Omicron come from?
Another great question. So remember, outbreaks generate variants and variants generate outbreaks, and it's a vicious cycle. And it's thought that Omicron arose somewhere in Southern Africa, possibly as a result of an infection of a person with an immunocompromising condition. And you can imagine several, but a common one would be, HIV infection, which suppresses the body's ability to respond to infection. So unlike a host not infected with HIV, an HIV-infected person's immune system doesn't jump on the virus and suppress it and kick it out of the body in 2 weeks. What happens is the infection is prolonged, and every time the body, it's kind of like the immune system, the defensive system is moving in slow motion. So as it throws a punch, the virus dodges. As it throws another punch, the virus dodges. So instead of being something where the immune system knocks the virus out, the virus is able to adapt and evolve against the immune system. And so it's thought that maybe Omicron arose in a situation like that because it has so many mutations in it. I mean, many of them we've seen before, but never in this particular combination and never so many in number as we see with Omicron.
From the standpoint of the International Vaccination Institute, if you were to have a rallying call this new year, this 2022, to the world leaders, what would that be?
So if 2021 was the year of vaccines, 2022 should be the year of vaccination. So all those people in the world who are unvaccinated, and that would be about 50, just under 40% now have not received a single dose. And 90% of the people in low-income countries have not been vaccinated at all. We need to vaccinate everybody. And now, as Omicron is spreading, we recognize that we may need booster doses as well. So vaccination, complete vaccination, maybe the original series, the two jabs that you got originally, plus a booster. And do we need to give boosters every 6 months? I hope not. That may be unrealistic. But it's going to be very important to make sure that people are fully vaccinated in order to gain the benefit of vaccination in reducing hospitalizations and deaths.
Dr. Kim, increasingly in policymakers, we hear the phrase, we're going to have to learn to live with coronavirus. Is that possible? Are humankind going to have to adapt to the presence of this virus, this condition? Is it going to be ever with us?
Yes, so in particular, among the coronaviruses, COVID-19, as it's evolved, as it's infected more and more people, as we've rolled out vaccines, we're going to have to start thinking about this probably the same way we think about influenza or the flu, that there may be additional or changes in the virus that require additional vaccinations. We hope that at some point, the research that many groups are doing to develop what we call a pan COVID-19 vaccine, a vaccine that works against potentially the current and future mutants, or a pan-coronavirus vaccine, one that works against not only this coronavirus that causes COVID, but the coronavirus that causes the Middle East respiratory syndrome, or the original SARS coronavirus, that a pan-coronavirus vaccine may actually protect us even better against a potential outbreak in the future. But that's actually work that's years away. And so for now, I think the idea that we're going to have to adjust to this, that countries are going to have to vaccinate, that we have to do everything possible to preserve life, to preserve human rights and the ability of people to make informed choices, and then finally to preserve livelihoods. So, the old life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness comes back in a different way when we look at a pandemic. We've been living with influenza for millennia, and we're going to have to adjust and do what we can, now tempered and given additional weapons to protect life by medical science. But this is something that countries are going to have to deal with at a policy level.
Dr. Jerome Kim, thank you so much for joining us once again on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you, and Happy New Year again.
Coming up after the break, Alex turns to Cambridge University's Dr. Chris Smith for an explanation as to why the virus is not yet under control. Join us then. Welcome back. Dr. Chris Smith, throughout the crisis, has been one of the most effective communicators on the development of the virus. He now speaks to Alex.
Dr. Chris Smith, welcome back to the Alex Salmond Show and Happy New Year.
Yes, indeed. Happy New Year.
But of course, Chris, it's new year, new variant. Omicron, how much different is this strain of the virus from the other strains like Delta?
Well, they're all part of the same family, and they are therefore related because they're all coronaviruses, and they're coronaviruses which are part of this COVID-19 family. But when Omicron was first detected in southern Africa, it was Angelique Coetzee, who was the GP in South Africa, who first noticed that a slew of patients were coming to her surgery with similar symptoms, but quite remote from the holy trinity that we'd been using to diagnose COVID prior to that time, of loss of sense of smell and taste, new cough, high fever. These patients were presenting a bit differently. They had a sort of scratchy sore throat, bit of a fever, bit of a cough, and felt very, very tired. But otherwise, they were pretty trivially unwell. And it was thanks to her spotting that there was some pattern and testing these people that actually Omicron came to light. Otherwise, it probably wouldn't do. But when she tested these patients, that's when really the alarm bells began to ring, because the genetic code said not Omicron, but oh my God. And what they showed is a very big group of mutations or changes, 50 or so genetic spelling mistakes in this particular virus compared to the previous strains we'd seen. Some of those genetic changes we had seen before, some were new, but we'd never seen so many of them all in one place at the same time, with a big concentration of them in the part of the virus code that it uses to make the outer coat of the virus, and specifically the spike that it uses to get into our cells. And that's the thing that was in all the vaccines, which is why people were concerned we might have a very transmissible variant on our hands, and that transpired to be absolutely the case. But because the virus has also changed so dramatically, it's altered its modus operandi. It's changed tactics. It gets into our cells in a different way. And the consequence of that is it seems to be producing a less severe illness when it does infect people, despite being able to infect many more people than previous variants.
Now, can we tell if Omicron developed at some point in the late last year when Dr. Coetzee identified it, or has it been sleeping somewhere for the last year or so and only is now detected because it manifested it in a system like South Africa, a health system where they do tests?
We don't know. The likelihood is that this is what we call a de novo mutation, in the sense that it hasn't circulated broadly. And the profile of changes it has strongly suggests that this has been developing or growing, perhaps in a single individual actually, for a prolonged period of time. We saw a similar thing with the so-called Kent or Alpha variant about a year ago. And this was suggested to have arisen in the UK in an individual who was immunosuppressed. And if you're immunosuppressed, you don't fight the virus off quite as well as someone who's not immunosuppressed. And this gives the virus lots of time to adapt, change, and evolve within an individual, seeing a partial immune response and therefore learning something about and adapting to our immune responses. It's possible that in that part of Southern Africa where this Omicron variant evolved and emerged from, because there's very high prevalence of immune disabling diseases, chiefly HIV, where in some parts of South Africa, you're looking at the prevalence of 50% or more of the population treated, thankfully, most of them, but many not. This means you've got virus infecting people with an impaired immune response on top of malnutrition, poor living conditions, and so on, all of which can conspire to make the situation worse. And that could have led to the elaboration of all these changes in this virus and the production of Omicron. That's one theory. We don't know for sure at the moment if that's the right one. Way back in the 1890s, there was what we thought was a flu pandemic. In fact, it was called the Russian flu. And this was a pandemic. It led to very wide-scale mortality, including members of Queen Victoria's household actually died of this so-called flu pandemic. But in recent years, scientists have done some molecular forensics. And what they think actually was happening was that was a coronavirus. In fact, it was a bovine or cow coronavirus that, because we were keeping large numbers of cows, jumped the species barrier, got into humans, became a human pandemic coronavirus, which we had never seen before. So it made people very ill to start with, spread very broadly because no one was immune to it, but quite quickly effectively immunized the entire world population and then retreated into the background accruing along the way some genetic changes in the virus that made it a better bedfellow with humans. And that virus persists to this day as a virus excitingly called OC43, but it's a common human coronavirus. It causes the common cold. So we speculate that coronavirus causing COVID will go the same way ultimately. It's just the path we take to get there. Hopefully we don't suffer the death toll that previous pandemic strains would have had to cause in order to get there. We can short circuit the equation with drugs and vaccines.
Now, you've been one of the first scientists to write that we're going to have to look at some point about living alongside the coronavirus. What exactly do you mean by that? And isn't there a danger, death toll in the UK, well, this is a milder strain of the illness, it's still 300 or so a day, which is like a plane crash every single day. So the idea that it's a milder illness is relative to the other variants.
It's worth highlighting that actually a jumbo jet crash every day is roughly the number of people who die because of smoking cigarettes. And this is a tiny number of people who will be killed ultimately by the pandemic, which we've sleptwalked into, which is overweight, obesity and malnutrition, which is affecting half the world population right now. But that to one side, yes, I think we are now seeing pretty much across the board, even countries that had pursued a very, very strong, very powerful zero COVID approach to start with, accepting that we are seeing an endemic disease. We're seeing something which is not going to go away in the foreseeable future. And therefore, we have to make a plan for how we work alongside it. We tolerate it, we control it, but we can't eradicate it. The right thing to do when you first see an emerging infection or a new disease is to respond to it very vigorously, very strongly, and you expect that you are going to be able to control it. Basically, you're planning for the fact that you can stop this thing, but then you have to accept at some point you might not be able to. Now, that's what New Zealand did. It's what Australia did. They used their geography and other tactics to control the virus and keep it to really low levels. But they have had to accept that unless they want to keep their countries completely isolated forever, then they're going to have to, at some point, accept the virus into their country and end up with cases, which is what's now happening. Australia has got very, very high levels of cases, for example. So really, it's a question of migrating from a state where there's really high levels of virus activity to controlled, tolerated levels of virus activity, but ones which are with few consequences. And there's a difference between cases that cause consequences and cases that don't cause consequences. We accept at the same time this is an infection that's not going to go away in the foreseeable future.
Finally, Dr. Chris Smith, the science came to our rescue. Omicron partially evades some of the vaccines we have, but they still ameliorate the condition. Is there a hope that there'll be a more traditional vaccine emerging, taking longer to produce, which will operate virtually against all variants, a whole virus vaccine? Is that on the horizon or in the near future?
This is what scientists are dubbing COVID vaccine 2.0. And there's a number of avenues to consider here. This week, just gone, we've seen some quite exciting data, actually from the UK, where they've compared people who live with people who caught coronavirus and got it, and people who live with people who caught coronavirus and didn't get it. And they asked the question, why do some people, despite very close contact with coronavirus cases, not catch the infection? It looks like those people who were immune to infection from their housemates actually have various immune functions given to them by prior exposure to other coronaviruses. And so this leads us to speculate that because of this family of viruses, there are some parts of the virus that never change. It doesn't matter what variant you're talking about. The virus has these linchpin components which can never vary. If we make an immune response against those, it seems to protect us broadly against many members of the same family of viruses. So one very tempting, tantalizing, and hopefully reasonable, realistic prospect is that we make vaccines that incorporate some of those crucial linchpin bits of the virus that never change from one variant to the next. If we do that, we will have COVID vaccine 2.0, which will protect us not just against the variants we do know, but those that don't even exist yet. And that's what scientists are working on at the moment. And there's some evidence that that's likely to be possible. In the near term, though, the current focus is on updating the current vaccines we do have to better reflect the variants that are circulating so that we get protection against those using tried and trusted and tested technology in the near term, while continuing to develop these other more ambitious strategies longer term, which is going to take a while.
On that tempting, tantalising and optimistic note, Dr. Chris Smith, thank you so much for joining us once again on the Alex Salmond Show.
This Christmas came as an unwelcome shock to the governments of the US, France and Britain, three of the most vaccinated countries on the planet. With the Omicron variant surging out of control, splits merged within the four administrations of the UK and within the governing Conservative Party about how to deal with the resurgent virus. In America, President Biden placed the emphasis on the individual states for virus control, which significantly was not the approach he took as a candidate when President Trump was facing runaway infection rates. Meanwhile, in France, President Macron tried to turn up the heat on the unvaccinated, but also succeeded in dividing French opinion. The vaccines have substantially weakened the link between the infection, hospitalisation and death. But worldwide, up to 50,000 deaths are still being recorded each and every week, and even highly vaccinated countries have clearly failed to crack the epidemic. Meanwhile, the pace of the rollout of the vaccine to the developing world still looks irresponsibly slow. The emergence of Omicron has been a humbling lesson for policymakers, but they can't say they weren't well warned about the likelihood of a hyper-infectious variant. Indeed, humankind may have dodged the Omicron bullet, given the generally less grave nature of the disease it presents. More substantial progress has come in the range of new treatments once people are infected. However, the sheer weight of numbers has placed health provision, even in the most advanced countries, under enormous pressure. Now, increasingly, commentators are looking forward to a world where humankind learns to live alongside with the virus. All pandemics move at some stage to an endemic phase, but given the vast numbers of people unprotected worldwide, the certainty of yet more variants and the cumulative pressure on health provision for far, far too many people, it will not be a question of living with the virus, but of dying from it. But for now, from Alex, myself and all at the show, it's goodbye, stay safe, and we hope to see you all again next week.